Move into meditation now. I invite you to breathe, as Patrick read, that inspiration, the inward breath that we receive is the gift of life. It is the energy of God. So allow yourself to relax into this moment, breathing in deeply and exhaling out completely. As we sing together, turning to the breath of God.
Breathing, I am alive. Knowing, I am wise. Receiving, heart open wide. Giving, I am satisfied. Returning to the breath of God. 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 Seeing through God's eyes. Waking, now I thrive. Feeling, I have arrived. Loving is my God. Returning to the breath of 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 God.
And as we move deeper into this time of conscious contact with the Lord of our being, we do breathe deeper. Breathing in the pure essence of God and breathing out, letting go and letting God be God in us right here, right now. In the stillness of this moment, we become more aware of the activity of God. In the quiet of this moment, we hear the voice of God with greater clarity. And in the peace of this moment, we connect with the energy of God that guides us forward in all that we do. Letting go of our egos, letting go of what we know, and trusting the divine mystery to guide us into a greater expression of love and light and peace and joy. So take another moment to just notice what you're most aware of in this moment. Is it the peace and joy and love of God, or is it something that you brought with you? A concern, a judgment, a fear, a worry. And whatever that is for you, give it a name. And then I invite you to offer it up to God. Offer it to your higher mind. Offer it to God mind. Offer it to the Christ consciousness. And notice what happens. The transformation of any negativity into something positive. Taking another deep breath. Breathing out, surrendering deeper and deeper. How much can you surrender and trust the presence of God in your life? Knowing that everything is unfolding in divine order, that everything is happening for a divine purpose in your life, in the lives of your loved ones, and in the life of our planet. And so we allow that loving, nurturing presence, the soul of God, to bless us, to remind us of the truth that all is well, to empower us to move from judgment to compassion, from fear to love, and from any discord into harmony. And in this truth, and in this prayer, and in this meditation and activity, we find ourselves at one in God and with each other, knowing that there really is no other. There is just one of us in the mind and heart of God, expressing the truth of who we are, letting go, and letting go. And in this truth, we find ourselves depending on the power of God to orchestrate our lives, to move us into the greatest expression, the highest expression of our lives, with more grace, more joy, more peace, more love. I depend on God. We move into the stillness. I depend on God. As we move into the silence, I depend on God. And as we have touched the stillness, even for this brief time, we bring our awareness back to this room, empowered by the connection with our higher selves, with the presence of God, with the Christ consciousness, feeling more peace, more joy, more love. As we sing again, returning to the breath of God. Breathing, I am alive, knowing I am wise, receiving, heart open wide, giving, I am satisfied, returning to the breath of God, returning
returning to the breath of God, returning to the breath of God.
So one day, a couple that had been married for 40 years got into their car to go out to brunch. And as they were backing out of the driveway, the wife said to her husband, who was driving, "Put your seatbelt on." And they just kept driving, and he pulled out and started driving down the street. And she kindly said, "Put your seatbelt on." And kept driving and come up to a stop sign, and just does one of those California rolls through the stop sign. And as he's doing that, he notices there's a cop parked on the side street. And so they keep driving, and he puts his seatbelt on. And sure enough, he gets pulled over by the police officer, and the police officer comes up to the car and asks the gentleman, "Can I have your driver's license and registration, insurance?" And he says, "Sure." He says, "Officer, can you tell me what I did?" And he's all worried about rolling through the stop sign. And he says, "I noticed, well, you didn't have your seatbelt on." He says, "But I have my seatbelt on." "But you didn't have your seatbelt on." "But I have my seatbelt on." So he bends down, looks over at the wife, says, "Ma'am, did he have his seatbelt on?" And she says, "Officer, I've been married to this man for over 40 years, and I know better than to ever argue with him after he's been drinking." One for the Al-Anons. That's my favorite recovery joke. I love that. So we're sharing today about the third principle for spiritual living, which is surrender. Sweet surrender. Surrendering into the presence of God. You know, surrender for most of us at some time in our lives feels like a death, right? We got to give up something. We got to stop something. We got to just quit something. And it almost feels like a death at times. Like, oh, I just don't want to give this up. And say, you know, why does everything I let go of have claw marks on it? Like that idea that we just don't want to surrender. We don't want to let go. And yet, when we surrender our ideas, our will, to something greater is possible. So the idea most of the time with surrender, it's like we're surrendering, we're just giving up, right? But as we have looked at already about, you know, coming to believe in a power greater than ourselves, that's what we're surrendering into. We're surrendering into a more divine solution, a more loving solution, a greater solution that I could think of myself, a power greater than myself. And yet, what we find out, and like we read in the grace prayer, is God's will is my will. But my will isn't always God's will. So our work in this surrender is to align ourselves with God's will, to align ourselves with that divine energy, that wisdom that leads us into a greater expression of who we are and the life that we want to live. You know, I first came across this idea of God's will and my will are the same because my recovery background would always tell me, not my will, but God's be done. And I could never connect with this idea that God's will is and my will are the same. But it was a study in A Course in Miracles that teaches that God's will and my will are the same. And we teach that in Unity too. So, but the idea is that you have to align yourself with that higher purpose. And the best way to do that is through surrender. Just think about a challenge in your life, something that you're facing. And what's your solution? Is it a win-win? Is it to get revenge or something? There's a wonderful line by Dr. Wayne Dyer who said, if you're going for revenge, you better dig 2 graves. Because that act of harming another, no matter how justified, harms us. And so when we surrender into the truth and the love of God, things take care of themselves and it becomes a win-win. And everyone is blessed through the situations. How do we surrender? How do we do that? Prayer and meditation, Charles Fillmore said, be still and turn within to the great source. I love that name that he had for God, the great source. If those of you who are Abraham Hicks fans, it's always the source, right? We talk about God as source. And so in this surrender process, we're surrendering our own will to this greater source that provides us with greater wisdom for a more perfect solution. So we depend on God. So Jesus said it this way. He said, anyone who wants to follow me, anybody who wants what I have, needs to let go, needs to surrender, needs to renounce himself or herself. And it's not something that we really hear when we read that scripture. Anybody who wants to follow me needs to renounce himself or herself. Do you think about that on your spiritual journey? And again, remember that metaphysically, Jesus isn't outside of you. It's not Jesus telling you this. It's your Christ consciousness. It's your higher nature that's telling you that if I want to live in Christ consciousness, if I want to live in my highest self, I have to renounce myself, my ego, right? My lower self, all that stuff that I think is right, that stuff that I've created in my life out of fear, out of the ego, whatever it is that's guiding me, and really be willing to let it go, to renounce myself and to allow that higher self to come out. Easier said than done, right? How many times in my lifetime do I take the wheel back, right? How many times do I think I know the solution? But as an individual, as a community, as a world, the more that we do this, the more that we surrender into this higher power, the more grace we receive, the more joy and the more love we get to experience. I shared in the first lesson on this series, about acceptance, part of the first step, right? Admitting our powerlessness and our unmanageability. And there's a lot of acceptance that has to come with that. And acceptance is another part of our surrender. When we can see that we've hit the wall, or when we're at the end of our rope, or whatever that challenge is, that it's time to let go and it's time to trust something greater than ourselves. And so one of the steps in surrender is to accept it, to notice that, okay, I've come to the end of my resources. I don't know what to do here. And isn't it interesting that we get to that place, that we don't surrender at the beginning of the challenge? It's like, okay, it's time to pray now, right? We use prayer as a last resort. What if we used it as a first resort? What if God was present, we're present to God and this divine energy in the beginning of everything that goes on in our lives? So this step is an amazing step, just not just for people in recovery, but also for their loved ones, and I would say for everyone, because it's interesting in the recovery world that there was another organization that grew out of the 12 Steps for Alcoholics called Al-Anon. And one of the challenges of people in Al-Anon with loved ones who are practicing their alcoholism is that they try to control them and manipulate and enable so that the problem doesn't seem as bad as it is. And sometimes the Al-Anon person suffers more than the alcoholic because there's so much insanity in trying to keep someone's life together and your own life falls apart, which is kind of the definition of codependency. And a lot of us are in the helping professions, and a lot of us have loved ones who suffer from addiction, and we want to help them, and we want to fix them. But we finally, eventually discover that we can't. We can't change them. And I've been working with people in recovery for over 30 years, and the only ones who ever get sober and clean are the ones who want it, not the people that need it. Because we all need it, right? I mean, we all need something, but the people who want it are the ones who get sobriety or transform their lives if it doesn't have to do with addiction. So I want to share a little story about this from Father Greg Boyle, who started Homeboys Industry out in LA years ago, working with the gang communities. He says, "I don't believe in mistakes. Everything belongs. And as the homies say, it's all good. I do believe in lessons learned. I have learned that you work with gang members and not with gangs. Otherwise, you reinforce the cohesion of gangs and supply them oxygen. I know now that gang warfare is not the Middle East or Northern Ireland. There is violence in gang violence, but there is no conflict. It is not about something. It is the language of the despondent and the traumatized. In my 30 years of ministry to gang members in LA, the most significant reversal of course for me happened somewhere during my 6th year. I had mistakenly tried to save young men and women trapped in gang life. But then, in an instant, I learned that saving lives is for the Coast Guard. Me wanting a gang member to have a different life would never be the same as that gang member wanting to have one. I discovered that you do not go to the margins to rescue anyone, but if you go there, everyone finds rescue. Me wanting a gang, sorry, I just read that. Louis was 19 years old, a gang member, making money hand over fist by running up to cars and selling them crack cocaine. He quickly became his own best customer. After many attempts to get him into rehab, he finally agreed to check himself in. He was there 1 month when his younger brother Eric did something that gang members never do. He put a gun to his head and killed himself. Gang members are much more inclined to walk into enemy turf and hope to die than to pull a trigger on themselves. I called Louis and told him what had happened, and he was crestfallen. I will pick you up for the funeral, I said, but I'm driving you right back. I want to come back, he said through his tears. I like how recovery feels. When I arrived at the rehab center, Louis greeted me with an umbrazo, and once in the car, he launches in. I had a dream last night, and you were in it. In the dream, he tells me, the two of us are in a darkened room, no light whatsoever, no illuminated exit signs, no light creeping in under the door, total darkness. We are not speaking, but he knows I am in the room with him. Then I silently Then silently, I pull a flashlight from my pocket and aim steadily on the light switch across the room. Louis tells me that he knows that only he can turn the light switch on. He expresses his gratitude that I happen to have a flashlight. Then, with great trepidation, Louis moves slowly toward the light switch, following closely the guiding beam of light. He takes a deep breath, flips on the switch, and the room is flooded with light. As he tells me this, he begins sobbing. And the light, he says, is better than the darkness, as though he had not known this was the case. We cannot turn the light switch on for anyone, but we can all have a flashlight. With any luck, on any given day, we know where to aim them for each other. We do not rescue anyone at the margins, but go figure, if we stand at the margins, we are all rescued. No mistake about it. This is a man with a lot of wisdom who knows that truth, that we can't rescue anyone. We can't save anyone. We can point the way. We can give them a book. We can teach them a meditation. We can do all that. But unless we want to change, unless we are willing to surrender to that deepest and highest and widest part of us, nothing will change. And it's a big deal. Because, we've had experiences in life where it hasn't felt safe to surrender, where we've had to do everything we can to hold on to whatever is happening in our lives. But if we are willing to renounce ourselves and follow that higher vibration, that higher consciousness, then we will experience the love and light of God in a new way. So let's take a moment to know this inwardly as we join together in prayer. So, dear loving Father, Mother God, put me in the places you want me to be, with the people you want me to be with, doing the things you want me to do. Thank you for the joys and the challenges of this life that guide me to trust, to surrender, to believe in this greater power that is working for our good. We give thanks and pray this in the name and in the nature of the indwelling Christ presence. And so it is. Amen.